I'm going to focus on reporting the effects of the intervention. And as I just said, this isn't just about the plain language summaries, but anywhere that you might be presenting the results of your systematic review or of somebody else's systematic review. Oops, sorry, that was in the wrong direction. Yeah, so as I said, I'm going to be focusing on problems, on typical problems that we often find when people present the results of a systematic review. And then at the end, I'll talk about the solution that we're going to be working on. So a very typical problem still is picking the wrong outcomes. So all result summaries, whether they're plain language summaries or any other summary, needs to focus on the most important outcomes, not the outcomes with the best or the most interesting results. And this includes empty outcomes, so outcomes where you found no evidence. So if you've decided in your review that pain is your primary outcome, you need to present pain even if you found nothing. You simply need to say, we found nothing. You can't simply move on to the ones which are less important but have more interesting results. And this can't be said often enough, and this happens still. A second issue, which is also a really frustrating issue, is that people forget about the fact that they've put all that effort into doing a grade assessment, but have actually not thought about using it in their presentation. So this is a typical scenario where somebody will say, this review found that the intervention leads to large improvements in, for instance, pain, which is, quite an impressive result. And then way down below, they'll mention that the certainty of the evidence was low. And those two pieces of information have been divorced from each other, which is really unfortunate. So as a rule, always include information about the certainty of the evidence with the information about effect. You always need to present those types of information or those two pieces of information together. So another problem, which is getting better, but is still quite common, is a focus on statistical significance. So this is a sentence that we still see quite often. The treatment led to a statistically significant improvement in pain. Now that simply means that the effect is unlikely to be by chance. It doesn't actually tell you whether that improvement in pain was clinically significant for the patient. So forget about statistical significance when you're presenting the results of your review and focus on whether something was clinically significant instead. Another problem is that people still aren't very good at explaining the scales that may have been used to measure the outcome. So here's a fictitious example. There was a 2-point reduction in pain measured on the Hattie-Fnatt scale. Well, I have no idea what the Hattie-Fnatt scale is. I have no idea if a 2-point reduction is a good reduction or a bad reduction or a big reduction or a small reduction. If you're using scales, tell people how big the scale was. Did it move from 1 to 10, from 1 to 100? Always describe the size of the scale and always describe whether a high score or a low score is a good thing. Another really frustrating problem, which we've seen a lot in the coverage of the COVID research, is confusing evidence of no effect and no evidence of effect. So here's a very typical statement you see in Cochrane reviews and you see in many other reviews. There is no evidence to support the intervention. So does that mean we know it doesn't work? Or does it mean we don't know if it works? And I'm just going to stop for a minute and you can think about that. So if you're a typical person, you're probably slightly confused and not completely 100% sure. And this is a typical front page of a Daily Mail article. Which says cough syrup is a waste of time. So cough syrup does not work. Experts reveal popular treatments that don't make a difference. And underneath it says there are many treatments that have little or no evidence to support use. So they've taken that sentence and they've interpreted it as it doesn't work. It's a waste of time. And I actually went back to that systematic review to see what they meant. And sure enough, the systematic review authors have said there is little or no evidence to support the use of cough syrup. And then I went and looked at the numbers, and what they actually meant was, we don't know. So this is a really important misunderstanding. Saying cough syrup, we don't know if it works, is a very different presentation than saying it's a complete waste of time. So this is something you really need to think about. Another problem is that people sometimes formulate their results as recommendations. And in Cochrane, the aim of a Cochrane review is to provide the best available evidence. It is not to recommend what people should actually choose. And if you're writing a Cochrane review, you should not be including recommendations. You should simply be telling people what the evidence is. This is from a Cochrane training module, and you can go and do this yourselves if you're interested. It's from a training module on common errors. But I'll give you a minute just to look at some of these and see if you can pinpoint any of these that you really don't think a Cochrane review should have included. So you can just note down which ones you think are the baddies. So I'm rushing on. So this was my judgment. And I think if you take a little bit more time, you'll realize that actually sometimes it's not black and white. It's something which actually needs some thought. Number 4, I think, is quite vague. And we can discuss that afterwards as well. But again, this is something you need to think about. Are you giving a recommendation? So those are some typical problems that we very often come across when we're looking at existing systematic reviews, both within Cochrane and otherwise. And one of the solutions that we've tried to develop is to develop a system called the grade narrative statements. So in this system, we're trying to find a reasonable balance between giving a reasonably precise representation of the evidence on the one hand, but also providing information that's actually accessible and understandable on the other hand. And that's quite a difficult balance. How do you tell people what the results of a review are in a way which they can understand, but which doesn't simplify too much? And that's not an easy task. So we've been working on this for probably over 15 years now. And recently, Grade has published this particular paper, which was led by Nancy Santesso in Canada, where we've presented the narrative statements, or the latest version of the narrative statements. And these statements are a combination of the size of the effect and the certainty of the evidence. So when you're creating your narrative statements that are presenting what your review found, your starting point is your summary of findings table, or the review author summary of findings table. And I'm going to be using this one as an example. This is a review on the effects of probiotics for children taking antibiotics. So as I'm sure you're aware, if you give children antibiotics, they'll very often have stomach problems such as diarrhea. And one particular approach to this potentially is to give them probiotics while they take antibiotics. So does this work? So here's the summary of findings table that review prepared. And I think you've probably, have you already gone through a summary of findings table, Matteo?
Yes, it was a Carsten presented the grade.
Okay, so you're familiar with this layout?
Yes, everyone here.
Okay, good. So just to repeat, the summary of findings table would present the outcomes. So in this case, they've looked at incidence of diarrhea, adverse events, duration of diarrhea, and stool frequency. They'll present the results in absolute numbers for the control group, the results in absolute numbers for the intervention group, the results typically as relative risk, the number of participants and the number of studies, and the quality of the evidence. And just to confuse you, quality is the same as certainty of the evidence. And I don't know if Karsten mentioned that's changed, but you'll see both terms used, but they are the same, quality of the evidence or certainty of the evidence. So when you're creating your narrative statements, what you need from this table is the information about what outcomes are the most important, the absolute results, and the certainty of the evidence. So that's the information that you typically would take from your summary of findings table to create your narrative statements. So how do you do this? Well, you start with one outcome, for instance, incidence of diarrhea, and you look at the results and you say, okay, am I seeing a large effect, a moderate effect, a small but important effect, or a trivial or small or unimportant effect, or no effect? And obviously this is the first challenge because this is a judgment. But setting aside that, you have to make that judgment and decide where you are on this scale. So when you reach a decision on that, you then look at the certainty of the evidence. Are you highly certain, moderately, low, very low certainty? Now, if you have high certainty, it's quite easy. You simply say if there's a large effect, that the intervention leads to a large increase in the outcome or reduction. If there's a moderate effect, the intervention increases the outcome. A small effect, it increases it slightly. And no effect, it may make little, or it makes little or no difference. So a pretty blanket statement, a clear statement, X leads to Y, X may make little or no difference to Y. However, if you have anything less than high certainty, you'll want to indicate that. You're trying to give an indication to the reader that this is not 100% sure, it's not written in stone, there is some level of uncertainty. And the way we've solved this in the English language is to add modifiers. So we've added X probably leads to Y for moderate, X may lead to Y for low, and for very low, the evidence is very uncertain. So we're using these modifiers, probably and may, to indicate to the audience that we're not 100% sure. And we can discuss whether or not those are the right words, and we have done for 20 years now, but the principle is to introduce that level of uncertainty. When you have a very low certainty result, frankly, what you're saying really is that we just don't know. And therefore, we think that it's, rather than presenting some which way the result goes, we think it's actually simpler to just say, we just don't know. The evidence is very uncertain. So that's the sort of general principle. And obviously, you may need to amend the statements to fit your review. You may be writing in another language than English. You may decide that increase or reduce is not the way you want to talk about that particular outcome. So you can play around with these statements. But any amendments that you make should not change the underlying principles that you need to use a consistent approach to describe the size of the effect and the certainty of the evidence. So I'm going to go through this example, and then I thought we could do an exercise where you try your hand at this. So as I mentioned, we're using this example from the probiotics and antibiotics review. So in this case, incidence of diarrhea. So in the control group, we have 191 children out of 1,000 who have diarrhea. But with probiotics, we have a point estimate of 88 per 1,000. So, I mean, as a parent, that's pretty, I find that a pretty good result. That's a pretty impressive result. Best case scenario in the confidence interval, we're all the way down to 67 children out of 1,000. And even worst case scenario is still 116. So even with the worst case scenario, we still have a quite impressive result. So as you need to interpret that, whether you think that's a large effect, a moderate effect, a small effect, or no effect at all. And then you need to combine that with the fact that the certainty of the evidence in this case is moderate. So what we ended up saying here was that fewer children probably get diarrhea. So the probably is tied to the fact that we're not 100% certain because we have moderate certainty evidence. So I'm rushing through this. I'm aware that you might have questions, but I thought we'll go through this once and then we'll do the exercise and then we can open up for questions. So when it comes to adverse events, actually, in this case, we don't really care what the results are because the certainty of the evidence is very low. So, I mean, as you can see from the point estimate, there isn't a particularly impressive result. So it looks like there aren't any adverse events, but with very low certainty of the evidence, the best we can say is we don't know if it led to any side effects because the evidence is very uncertain. Now, for duration of diarrhea, what you'll see is that the mean duration of diarrhea was 0.6 days fewer. And of course, one of the weaknesses of this review, if you remember back to my comment about the size of the scale, which is, we have a similar problem here. We don't actually know 0.6 days fewer than what. But let's assume a child on average would have diarrhea for about 3 days. In this case, we're seeing an improvement of 0.6 days. And then you need to make a judgment. Is that a big effect, a moderate effect, a small effect, or not an important effect at all? And then you need to combine that with the fact that we have low certainty evidence. And we're in a similar situation for stool frequency, where we have 0.3 fewer there, and a confidence interval which suggests no effect at all. So in these cases, we made a judgment that this wasn't a particularly impressive result. And we said it may make little or no difference in how long the diarrhea lasts. It may make little or no difference in how often children have bowel movements. So in the plain language summary, your presentation of the results might look something like this. So just text. So the review shows that when children on antibiotics are given probiotics compared to no probiotics, and then you list it up. So relatively brief and hopefully relatively clear, relatively plain language. In some cases, some review authors choose to add information about the level of certainty, and that's fine. Now, what about the numbers? So for many readers, these kinds of narrative statements like these, they are enough. And as a parent, it might be enough that you get this general gist that basically fewer children probably get diarrhea. And then that's sort of all they need to know. However, words, they are definitely more accessible, but numbers are more precise. And these words have sort of hidden the judgments that have been made based on the numbers. And of course, if we presented the numbers to the reader, they would have been able to make their own judgment about the importance of the effect. It could be that they came to a different judgment when it comes to how important these results actually were. So for instance, in duration of diarrhea, it could be that 0.6 days less diarrhea for a parent, or worst case scenario, 0.02, is actually an important impact. And we should that it makes little or no difference. So ideally, important outcomes. So for instance, if the duration of diarrhea hadn't been that, but it had actually been death, then these kinds of numbers suddenly make a really important difference. I'm getting a message that my internet connection is bad. Can you hear me okay?
We had a slight lag, but it's over now.
Okay. Just 2 seconds.
Okay, good. So basically my point was that the more important the outcome, the more important it might be to actually present the numbers so that people can see them. Our challenge in these kinds of summaries, so if you imagine a plain language summary or a press release or a newspaper report, it's really difficult to incorporate numbers into text in a way that's simple to understand. So for instance, if we'd incorporated the numbers into this first outcome, it would look something like that. So still relatively simple, but getting quite dense when it comes to level of information. Fewer children probably get diarrhea. 9 children per 100 who were given probiotics had diarrhea compared to 19 children per 100 who did not. Not so bad, but if you start filling that in for every outcome, you're getting quite dense. In addition, we haven't mentioned the confidence interval. And some people would say that confidence intervals are always important. Others would say that in certain cases, confidence intervals can be really important. So suddenly, we're getting even more dense. In addition, we'd have to explain what a confidence interval actually means, which many people will not necessarily understand. So we might want to say best case scenario, worst case scenario. But you can see that the information is getting more and more and more dense. And of course, if we start doing that for every outcome, it's getting longer and longer and longer. So this is a really difficult challenge. You have to sort of decide how important it is that people see the numbers in that summary. So one solution is that you could put the numbers in tables. So if you're, so in this version, sorry, I'll just go back. This is a relatively simple version of a summary of findings table where we've added the narrative statements next to the numbers. So people can move between the numbers and the narrative statements. Now, unfortunately, it's actually not possible to put tables in Cochrane plain language summaries at the moment, although there is discussions about changing that. So you could consider adding the narrative statements to your summary of findings table and then referring people to that. But if you do decide that you need to include numbers in your text, you need to link these clearly to the narrative statement so people can see the numbers and then move to the narrative statement and move between them and check that they've understood. And you need to use absolute numbers. Don't use relative risk, certainly not odds ratios, and probably not numbers needed to treat. Those are really much less easy to understand than absolute numbers. And certainly odds ratios are incredibly difficult to understand. We know that relative risk can bias people and lead them to overestimate the impact of an effect. So focus on absolute numbers. And if you don't include numbers in the text, consider how you could tell readers where they can find those numbers. So if you want to go for something relatively simple, such as the one example here about probiotics and antibiotics, you can include a link and say, this is where you can find the numbers. So I realized that was very, very rushed. But think about how you can use these narrative statements, not just in the plain language summary, but in your abstract, your main results, potentially also in your summary of findings table, and basically anywhere else where you're presenting your results. And I've listed some resources there, and I think the slides are in the share document.